Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you that have joined from overseas. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. For those of you that are regular watchers or attendees to our webinars, you know, we just leave it for 60 seconds or so just to allow everyone to settle in before we start. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll be starting the webinar shortly. Okay, Fiona, are you good to start shortly?
Yeah, thanks,
okay.
Melanie.
Thank you for joining us today. We have got Amedis join us, UKG company, and we're talking about the power of three, the impact of integrated HCM, WFM and payroll on global organisations. So today the webinar is being recorded, and we will also have the slides available. It'll be available on the website post webinar. We do want this to be interactive, so if you do have any questions, please add them in the chat box or on the Q&A, and we can come to those at the end of the webinar. So Fiona, I'm going to take myself off and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody. My name is Fiona Dardis. I'm the head of product here at Amedis, the UKG company. I'm delighted to be talking to you today about the power of three, the impact of integrated HCM, workforce management and payroll on global organizations. Here at UKG, I am responsible for a product that is a global payroll product, but I've spent the last 20 odd years working in HCM, workforce management and payroll. So it's a subject matter close to my heart. So hopefully you'll enjoy the webinar. Just in terms of topics that we're going to cover today, we're going to take you through the emerging new operating models for HR and what that has meant for the evolution of global payroll. And then we'll move on to the power of three. That will be where we talk about how the three technology types can work together and really make a big impact on organizations. And hopefully in that we'll get some time to talk through a couple of case studies. And they're like actual live examples of where I've worked on projects in the past that had a problem to solve in relation to how workforce management, HR and payroll could come together to solve the problem. So hopefully that will be useful. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about some emerging market trends. Okay, so emerging new operating models for HR. So I think it's fair to say that the world is changing and HR operating models that support organizations are also changing as a result. Over the last number of years, we've seen a significant shift in what companies look like and how they operate. As we all know, the world is getting smaller and we're definitely getting much more connected. So I don't know about you, but we frequently here in UKG have teams that are on the other side of the world in different time zones, and we're connected using technology or increasingly complex technology. So in addition, obviously, we've all just lived through like a life-altering event with the global pandemic starting in 2020. And that meant that how organizations work internally has also changed. So the model for working for an individual has become much more flexible in terms of both the hours that they work and potentially the location that they work in, and maybe the number of projects and activities that they work on at the same time. So frequently we recruit new people into an organization now. We're looking at hybrid roles. We're looking at a combination of a person being in person or working remotely. And, you know, for an organization, that's opened up a worldwide talent pool, and we can recruit from anywhere in any country or in any region. From my own perspective, I work very closely with a development team in Bulgaria in a city called Varna. And as a result of the pandemic, we now actually recruit all over Bulgaria instead of Varna, which is a relatively small city. So other organizations have gone much further than that, and they've started to hire across, say, the entire EMEA region as a result. And these types of HR decisions increase the overall complexity of the HR operating model as global organizations supporting global workforce in many complex legislative environments. So what do these operating models that are emerging in highly complex globalized organizations, so what are they? So based on McKinsey research, top HRDs are seeing 8 innovation shifts that are driving new operating models. So the first one is that they're seeing that their organizations are starting to adopt agile principles. So agile is basically a project methodology that we use very heavily in IT, where you iterate and you work in a very collaborative, dynamic environment where you change and you try things out. HR has long been a business area that kind of relied very heavily on custom and practice and heavily documented policies that were slow to evolve and change. The most successful organizations now are starting to bring in an element of agile to their HR teams. So teams can be innovative in trying to solve a problem in terms of maybe broadening the location of a search for a candidate to attract a wider talent pool. And this is particularly true for, like, say, specialist roles that are highly in demand. And agile means that a company can try out new things and respond to challenges quickly and evolve their models. So that's one of the innovations that we're seeing. The second one that we're seeing is these organizations are starting to excel and focus very much on the employee experience. So given that we're now in a global marketplace for talent, attracting and retaining key people is fundamental to organizational success. So organizations that focus on optimizing that employee experience from an onboarding perspective or a talent development perspective, they're much more successful than organizations that are operating in the more traditional way. And throughout the COVID era, I think most organizations invested really heavily in this area. A lot of companies would have invested in communication tools like employee engagement platforms like Jostle or WorkVivo to try and help people feel connected to the organization that they're in when they work remotely. So that's all kind of powerful change that's happening. One of the other innovations we're seeing is that we're starting to see HR re-empower frontline leaders. So I think we did go through a phase where a lot of activity was kind of centralized and decision making was driven from the center from a HR perspective. But recognizing that we're working in global organizations where people are remote, people are recognizing, and organizations are recognizing that relationships on the ground and working closely with the local leader is important. So giving that local leader the ability to actually have some decision making and drive some of that from the front is really important. So another innovation that we are seeing is around the offer of individualized HR services. So this is more where you're working with the local HR business partner to provide a tailored service that might be more country specific in a global context within the parameters of the standardized process. So the idea is to contribute to employee engagement so that the employee feels like they're part of a more tailored experience and not just a cog in a wheel, but still within the realms of something that's standardized, but maybe with a more local flavor. One of the innovations that we're also seeing is the productization of HR. So essentially, this means that we've got a standard repeatable offering that exists as a package for all employees, regardless of their location. And while, for example, the benefits might not be the same in every region, the overall way that the HR service is delivered is standard, but the component parts in each country might be slightly differentiated. The final two innovations then, so the ability to integrate the design and delivery end to end with accountability. So what that means is that HR process and the delivery of the processes are consistent and work end to end. But at each stage of the process, we have an accountable person. And the real important part here is that the performance is measured to make sure that the outcomes are achieved. So that's really important. The final one that I just wanted to touch on is to move from process excellence to data excellence. So in the new world, I think everybody is clear that data is king. We've got so many innovations happening now around Gen AI and ChatGPT that, you know, that whole model of data and what that data insight can drive is really important. So it's almost assumed now that like processes are completely automated, so the HR system is automated to drive efficiency, but that the data collection that that's built on is really important, because that's allowing organizations to identify, for example, something that is going wrong early, so that HR can intervene and act locally before the actual business performance is impacted. So they're the new operating models. So what we can see is that five operating models are starting to emerge as a result of all of those changes that we're seeing in organizations. Ulrich, so it's based on traditional business partnering, but moving away from the idea that you're in a center of excellence. It's more so driven by support from virtual teams, and the business services are global and operations are digital. So that's one operating model. The second one is agile. Again, center of excellences are reduced, and the focus is on HR business partnering at an organizational advice and development level. X-driven, then, this is where an organization focuses on excellence and selected moments that matter to give an individualized experience. So having things as automated and standardized as possible, but when, for example, maybe somebody's onboarding, there's much more personalized touch. So they identify those moments that matter and actually tailor the service so that it's more kind of hands-on in those particular instances. Leader-led then is another operating model. So people leadership is in the hands of the line managers, and that means they're responsible for all budgetary aspects. And then the HR team is more supporting the line managers with intelligence and advice. And then the final one is machine powered. So HR focuses on the high touch interaction. So like I say, maybe when somebody is onboarding, where they might need more hand holding, or maybe offboarding or leaving the organization where a more personalized touch is required, but everything else is kind of used, everything else is automated and maybe using Gen AI tools to help that process. And realistically, no organization is just adopting one of these. Organizations are typically using a combination of these principles, and depending on their priorities, in order to move the HR operating model forward. So that's the HR operating models. So the evolution of global payroll. So what's happening in the global payroll space? So in conjunction with the shift in the HR operating models, which has pretty much been driven by the landscape that we're in right now, the payroll landscape has been evolving significantly as well over the last 20 years to support the HR operating models. And this is increasingly true as we consider the global HR and payroll as companies grow and become much more globalized. As organizations have grown, many organizations have gone on their own HR and payroll transformation journey, and we see four main evolutions of payroll over the last 20 years or so as well. So payroll, I guess, traditionally was immature, and from a global perspective, in a global organization, a country was effectively acting as their own organization. So each country managed their own strategy and their own budget. And there was huge variability from country to country, even within the same organization. And local leadership really set the tone for what the local policy was, but also used local technologies to support the processes. Like, things were pretty manual. I remember my first job in London in the 90s. I was working for a global accounting firm. Everything was completely manual. We would do manual timesheets that were physically signed off by somebody and entered into a system that facilitated billing and facilitated payroll. So everything was paper-based. I moved in that same organization, which was a global organization, from Dublin to London. And even within that same organization, everything worked completely differently, completely different processes, completely different systems. And this was kind of typical experience of the era. So the next evolution that happened when we moved from manual to completely immature HR and payroll was the digitalization of payroll. So companies began to move away from paper-based systems and have an actual HR and payroll system. And typically this was a different vendor per country based on what was available locally and what could be supported, what could support the local practice. So the gain from an employee perspective, there was very limited access or interaction from these systems. We moved from paper-based requests for annual leave, for example, to maybe email requests that were keyed into a system by a HR or payroll admin. But again, very, very admin heavy and very, very manual. So the third iteration was the HR transformation. And we've seen a huge number of companies go through that, say, maybe 10 years ago, where a lot of companies moved, and a lot of global companies in particular, moved to a single HR system of record. And for the first time, the organization had their entire population on the HR platform. And that gave visibility and insight into things like the global headcount without weeks and weeks of work in Excel to try and gather data together and harmonize it to get a global view. What we're seeing increasingly now, and what we're kind of in the midst of, is the fourth evolution. And that's where we're seeing organizations move towards fully integrated people admin strategy. And this requires a significant tech investment, but provides a really high return on investment for those global organizations. It has the benefit of providing consistency in global HR and payroll processes and a high level of automation, and a significant improvement in the data quality, and then better insight into decision making as a result. So within an integrated standardized solution, it improves the ability to compare one country against another in terms of cost, and it gives that greater insight and more timely insight as well, because it's much easier to report out of these types of systems. So why integrate? A lot of companies are going on this journey, and it's an expensive journey to go on. So why are they doing it? Number one is the efficiency. So we create a record in the HR platform once, and it automatically syncs with the payroll for the relevant country. So you've got a single entry point and no duplication of effort. Much better reporting, like I said already, having a global view without having to manipulate data from multiple systems. So it's much shorter time to insight. Stronger compliance. I think it's really important in the environment that we're in now, where we've got massive compliance changes in various different countries to try and keep on top of that. So the investment in systems mean that you can rely on the system to maintain the compliance rather than relying on humans to intervene if there's a local legislative change, for example. Data security, really, really important one. I think we're all aware of like cyber attacks on various different organizations globally. In the old world, customers of ours and organizations would have had their own software installed on a local network or a local service. That's now moved to the cloud, where everything is centralized, where it's a single patch. If some kind of security alert or risk is identified, you're not having to patch multiple local sites and rely on people doing that. It's all kind of standardized. You're only patching one environment, and that's really important from a data security perspective. And then the enhanced experience. So you can imagine from an employee perspective, where systems are integrated and your HR record and your payroll record are on the one platform, the ability to be able to go in, look at your record, amend details that you might like to in terms of adjusting your bank account details, or if you've had new children and you need to add new dependents and things like that, to have the flexibility to view that all in one place and to be able to manage that. So that's some of the reasons why organizations are integrated. So where's the industry going next? So the power of three is like the next generation of where I believe global payroll and HR is going. And it's being triggered by a number of factors. Increasing labor regulations. I think that's a really important aspect of where we are now. Essentially, the COVID effect. As a result of the global pandemic, as we mentioned earlier, organizations, in a bid to be more competitive and to tap into local talent pools, have started to offer a completely different level of flexibility to employees. So they're offering remote working, fully remote, and they're offering hybrid packages where the employee can come in and out of the office. But that bears a huge burden of responsibility on an employer to make sure that their employees are remaining compliant and that they are an employer who is remaining compliant. So from a tax perspective, it's really important that an employer knows where an employee is working or how many days they're spending in a particular location. That type of knowledge was like a problem maybe for just some of the sales workforce in the past. Now you could be talking an entire organization needs to be monitored to make sure that people are actually tax resident in the country that you think they're tax resident in. Similarly, just from a local legislation perspective, it was much similar to monitor, you know, the number of hours that people were doing when they were in one physical location with set opening and closing hours. The risk with remote working is that people could be working long outside of the acceptable hours for a particular region and might be in breach, for example, of the working time directive. And, you know, these are massive risks for an employer to make sure that they're remaining compliant on. One of the other drivers for evolution in the HR and payroll for global employees is coming from the wider changes to the global market or the labour market itself. We're increasingly seeing trends in the labour market that require an employer to ensure that they can track and monitor time and make sure that they remain compliant. There are things that we're offering now as employers in terms of like demand for earned waged access, for example, that we need to make sure that we're actually paying minimum wage, that, you know, none of the things that we're offering are resulting that as an employer that we're in breach. Employees are increasingly transient, so they're coming and going a lot quicker into an organization. So the ability of an organization to onboard and upskill people is really important, and that's having an impact on the types of technology that's going to be required to support that. And increasingly, organizations are growing really, really quickly, and they're growing really, really quickly in a deskless workforce. So not people who are in a particular center, that you can have like standardized onboarding and standardized tracking of time. So this is where the power of three becomes increasingly important as we see organizations start to evolve now into integration between the HCM platform, the workforce management platform, and the payroll platform. So having all of these three integrated, so for example, the person is created in the HR system, they're brought into payroll when they join the organization, but in the workforce management system, they have all of their leave, they have all of their shifts, all of that type of information is held. And from an employee perspective, they're engaged typically using one app. So where there are pieces of information held about an employee in multiple systems, they have one employee experience to access that. In terms of the benefits of having the HCM, payroll, and workforce management system in one integrated solution, number one, it streamlines processes. So you're, as a newly onboarded employee, you exist in HR, you're synced with payroll, you're synced with workforce management. So there's a significantly reduced admin overhead from an organization in terms of like getting that person set up. There's a reduced opportunity for fraud because you're one person being set up on one system with all of the compliance checks and flowing automatically through into the other systems. Helps to provide a higher level of compliance, and again, that consolidated reporting. So we're in a global war for talent, so focusing on the end-to-end of the employee is key for many organizations to support their growth, and devolving a lot of that activity for onboarding, for example, accelerates and streamlines the process from an HR perspective, but also gives the employee insight and visibility into their organization. So the ability for an employee to almost self-onboard into multiple systems as a single piece of work means that onboarding time and ramp up time is reduced. And that's really important for organizations that are growing and growing really quickly. So consolidating HR, workforce management, and payroll, it gives huge advances in the insights that an organization can see in relation to, in particular, their blue collar workers, to be able to analyze that data really quickly. So from an employee experience, again, devolving all of those activities so the employee has access to everything themselves, and they're actually, you know, taking responsibility for that onboarding. And as organizations grow, the ability to do that in a fast and meaningful way is really important. And then the final piece is that insight. So to have that greater ability to dig into the insights, because you're comparing data from a workforce management system, data from a HR system, and data from a payroll system, that you can actually really get insight into what's happening in the organization in a really fast and meaningful way. Okay, So the ultimate goals of having obviously the three joined up is that speedy onboarding and offboarding, especially like in certain sectors, that's really, really important. So I've worked heavily in the retail sector, and we'll do a couple of case studies on that in a few minutes. But in the run up to, say, the Christmas period, having those people get onboarded and up to speed and on all the systems and available for work is really, really fast. They're really important. And again, subsequently post Christmas, to offboard those people relatively quickly is important. And then the whole employee experience, driving the retention of those employees, that if they have a nice experience with you, particularly if they're casual employees, they're much more likely to come back and work for you again in another busy period. That's key. So we're just going to touch on some real life examples of what happens when you bring the three elements together. So when you bring HCM, the workforce management, and the payroll system together. So the first one that we're going to look at, it was a high-end retailer, and essentially they were looking to maximize sales. They felt that there was more potential to maximize their sales, and they did a significant investment in HCM, payroll, and workforce management together, because obviously these are all blue-collar workers. These are all people who are hourly paid. So one of the things that was implemented here was to really invest heavily in understanding what the drivers were for the sales in the organization. And doing that, coupled with the workforce management solution, we built a rostering solution that had a skills matrix that relied on the skills that were attached to everybody, obviously, in the HCM. So say, for example, in this particular retailer, they noticed that there were cruise ships that would arrive into the city on a particular day, and depending on the people who were on board those ships, the ability to speak a particular language actually was influential in how we could drive sales in that particular retail store. So Chinese in particular, they identified, was a really key influencer. Some of the people who would come into that high-end retailer would be spending upwards of 100,000 euros. And if they had the right mix of Mandarin-speaking people on the floor, and enough of them in all of the various different areas, that really impacted the sales. So that was part of what was done in that particular scenario. So they were like, the outcome was they increased the overall level of sales, and that was really looking at the combination of the talent that they needed in store, coupled with some external factors like knowing what days the cruise ships were arriving and who the cohorts were on those cruise ships, and to just build that into the automation. So that really drove the sales in the particular stores, and actually overall then obviously influence the profitability of the organization, because they had the right people on hand with the right language skills to service the people who were coming into the store. A second one, and again it was a retailer, and this time they had like high volume, low cost, high volume of stores and low cost goods or clothes that they were selling in this particular scenario. So in retail, where you're focused on, driving sales, you're really also focused on controlling costs and margin. In this particular scenario, it was the same thing. So it was implemented a HCM, workforce management and payroll solution. And the whole premise of what was done here was to really focus on an automated rostering system. And that automated rostering system was to do two things. The first thing was to actually generate the rosters and fill all the slots for all of the hours that needed to be covered in the store in the best way possible, to ensure that minimal overtime was required by the staff in the store. So everybody potentially might have had, they might have been contracted for 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week, but to try and fill their contracted hours and not go above them. And that's much more efficiently done if it's done in a systemized way using a rostering system, as opposed to relying on a manager in a store manually creating the rosters every week. And obviously the complexity in those stores around people wanting to swap shifts and, to facilitate that whole process. So the outcome in this particular case was, like, number one, the overtime was reduced across every store in every region. So there was an overall improvement in the profitability of the business. But there was a couple of unintended consequences, like the employee engagement went up, because employees had much more flexibility in being able to swap shifts via an app, so they could see their roster really early in the week. They could swap shifts. It had to be approved by a manager. But the other thing it did was it drove the amount of time that the store manager could also be on the shop floor, which in turn actually helped drive the number of sales. So those guys being on the shop floor, helping and training staff, not being in the office trying to come up with a roster and moving people around on the roster. So it had a massive impact on the organization, who was in financial difficulty at the time, and really over a period of 18 months rolling this out to all of their stores really had a massive impact on the profitability. The other thing just to say around the employee piece was that engagement piece that they had. Like they liked working for this employer because of the visibility and the use of tech, especially the younger people, the use of tech, the ability to use the shift swapping capability on the app meant that, a lot of these people were students who were working in the store, especially like on a part-time basis over Christmas, that they actually went back to those stores in the summertime. It drove engagement with that particular employer, which then had another double whammy for that employer, in that people had worked there already. They didn't require the same type of onboarding the second time round, or the same type of training. It was just much quicker to get people effective. So there are a couple of examples, real life examples of what can go really well when we start to leverage the power of three and bring the workforce management, HCM and payroll together. So I'm just going to wrap up now by talking about some emerging trends. So moving from support to leadership. So one of the most significant trends that we can see following the COVID pandemic is the elevation of the role of the CHRO. So having a very coherent, forward-facing people strategy helped people to navigate a period that was very volatile, and really highlighted the importance of people as an asset to the organization, but also highlighted the importance of the CHRO and the people strategy. So HR has effectively moved from more of a support type role to a key leadership position, and they're at the top table now in many organizations, alongside the CFO and the CRO, for example. So in order to support this new senior leadership level, many of the CHROs that we're seeing are driving a program of technology transformation in their business, in the people space in particular. So the businesses that are driving innovation by improving the technology in the HR space are outperforming those who aren't on this journey. So the tech strategy aligned to support the business strategy, but particularly around the area of HR, is really impacting the future performance of organizations. So a company's ability to be able to harness both excellence in the HR and IT strategy will be a key indicator of future performance. So where companies have invested in the HR and IT strategy, and they have elevated that CHRO position, we would see that it is making it's a big driver of how that organization is going to perform in the future. And it's recognizing that people are the key resource in every organization, and optimizing that resource. And it's fundamental to the future of the organizations. So 73% of respondents at top performing companies now say that their most senior tech are highly involved in shaping the company-wide strategy. So specifically honing in on that talent acquisition strategy for IT individuals, and using those IT individuals to support both the business strategy and the HR strategy. It's really complementary, and really making a big impact on how companies will perform into the future. So you can see here, we have just to show like the impact on an organization's capability for managing their IT talent, and how that increases the effectiveness of the organization. So this just sets out the top performing companies, and you can see that those who are really working hard in this area and tapping into the IT talent using their HR strategy are the companies that are outperforming. And we would think that is a strategy that is going to continue into the future. So really, really important to kind of recognize the importance of the CHRO role, the people strategy role, and how like that investment in IT and that investment in tech are going to drive the companies of the future. particularly when we're talking about global organizations. So hopefully that gave you a good flavor of bringing the three together. So integrating HCM, payroll, and workforce management, and what that's going to do to organizations, and just giving you an idea of where we're seeing a shift in HR, where we're seeing shifts in payroll, and what we think the future changes are going to be. So thanks very much.
So really, it's interesting, isn't it, that technology, getting the technology right, really is the way to attract and maintain employees, isn't it?
Absolutely. And just having that people strategy and that HR strategy aligned is going to be fundamental to the future performance. That's certainly what we're seeing in terms of industry trends right now. Those who are really aligning on those two strategies are really making much bigger, faster progress compared to those who aren't.
And I think when you think about the younger generation, I suppose if your technology isn't up there, they're going to be thinking, why don't you do this? You know, they have their mobiles, they have the apps, they have, you know, all these fantastic things they can do now, and it's more obvious, isn't it? I suppose if you're not with it as such.
Yeah, exactly. And that second case study, like that was one of the things that drove the employee engagement there. The fact that it was tech led, that it was all accessible on a mobile app, that it was easy. And, you know, the younger generation are just like digital first. Everything that they do interacts via their phone. So if you're not moving towards that, then, you know, capturing their imagination and them wanting to be part of your organization, especially if they're IT savvy and they're IT roles that you're trying to fill, really, really important to try and use that to drive that engagement of those employees.
So it's you know, not to be scared of change, you know, don't think things can't be changed, you know, looking forward and looking what's out there.
Yeah, and embracing the technology that's out there, and especially, you know, in how we try and acquire talent in the future and how we manage that talent through the organization. They want to be dealt with in the way that they deal with the rest of the world, and typically that's through their mobile.
Yeah.
So that's why mobile apps are becoming really, really important.
Okay, so we have a question here: how to harmonize two contradicting objectives, individual service and efficiency?
And it's a tricky one, right? So I think that's, if you think about the emerging trends that we talked about in the beginning, the idea is to maybe look at those key points of contact. So where those like significant events are happening in the life cycle of an employee, that those become more personalized and those become more high touch, but that we're using automation to actually drive the regular processes. So for example, you know, making it really easy to submit an overtime timesheet or to update your bank account details. They're kind of regular, repeatable processes. But somebody who has is going through offboarding, for example, or maternity leave, those should be much more high tech or high touch processes. And that's where you like should maybe offer that higher touch service and restrict your time for HR and payroll professionals to engage with the employee, as opposed to, you know, the regular things. So try and get rid of and standardize the things that are can be automated as much as possible, so that you free up people's time to actually spend time on things that are more complex, that are going to require employee advice or calls or that just direct interaction with the employee.
Yeah. So we do have a question also. At my company, we don't have a central global time or payroll system. Where's the best place to start? Is it better to have the time system first or payroll?
Well, every organization has a payroll system. So like, well, I say every organization, pretty much everyone has a payroll engine or has a managed service. So like payroll, I think is the first instance. And then as the organization gets larger, like for example, you know, initially you might be recording some things on Excel spreadsheets and potentially loading them into the payroll engine. But longer term, it's implementing that time and attendance and those rules to just automate that flow. But I would say the payroll engine would have to come first, because we all need to get paid.
Well, that is true. Everyone does need to get paid. We ran a survey with in partnership with Medis about 3 years ago. I think because of COVID, I can't remember. It's all rolled into one, hasn't it?
Mm.
I think 81% of people still used spreadsheets, Excel.
Wow. I think it depends on the organizations now. I think payroll professionals love spreadsheets, right? Let's be
Yeah.
honest. So there's always going to be an element of that, and Excel is really useful. But I think the days of calculating payroll using Excel are gone. Like pretty much every organization that I'm in contact with has a payroll engine. Either they license it themselves, or they have a managed service that they're contracting.
Yeah, we did actually ask afterwards why were you still using Excel, and it was just that some people were just a bit nervous of, it was almost like it was a guarantee. They had payroll software, but they just used that Excel as a, like a comforter maybe.
Yeah, and I think like payroll people are very exacting. They want things to be a particular way, so sometimes they can be slower to change than maybe other parts of the organization. But I definitely see a shift in the last number of years. I think with COVID and everything that's gone on, as much automation as can be achieved, because let's face it, everybody's working remotely. People are working very hard. I think most of us work harder remotely than we were in the office. So anywhere where we can save some time and try and get things automated, I'm all in favor of.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. We're coming to the end of the webinar. So if anybody would like to get in touch with you, can they contact you via LinkedIn or
directly? Yeah, you can contact me on LinkedIn, or you could email me. I'm fiona.dardis@ukg.com.
Well, thank you so much. And as I said, the webinar has been recorded, and the slides will also be available, and we'll send an email to everyone once they're up on the website. So thanks again, Fiona. Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye.